in front of this committee today. I'm looking forward to hearing your testimony. I'm looking forward to a productive and probably a rowdy discussion about the Trump administration's vision for the future of U.S. broadcasting. And in that, I'm going to recognize my colleague, Ranking Member Meeks, for any opening statement that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Lake, I thank you for joining us today. First, I'd like to address President Trump's recent strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, an action taken without consulting the committee or securing congressional authorization. And it's troubling that Secretary Rubio is not sitting here today and that Republican members are avoiding oversight on such grave matters of war and peace that fall squarely on this committee's jurisdiction. Instead, as this hearing's title shows, we're returning to House Republicans' fixation on far-fetched conspiracies, this time to tear down the U.S. Agency for Global Media and the important work it supports. This tracks with President Trump's broad record of denigrating federal agencies and appointing leaders that, far from shepherding their agencies to success, are stewards of their sabotage. And I believe, Ms. Lake, you fall into this category. The story of the United States Agency for Global Media began with the Voice of America countering Nazi propaganda. That mission endured through the Cold War and continues today. USAGM is mandated to reach heavily censored countries with trusted information because Congress recognized that factual reporting contributes to international peace and stability and is in the interest of the United States of America. The irony that USAGM is now being undone under a banner of disinformation is not lost on me. Worse, some Republicans want it to be transformed into every propaganda machine we oppose abroad. The Trump administration's short-sighted dismantling of USAGM echoes its attacks on the U.S. Agency for International Development, spinning false narratives about corruption and waste to dismantle effective institutions Congress established with bipartisan support. Ms. Lake, if it was your goal at USAGM to use falsehood to advance an agenda, I believe then you're qualified for this job. Your opening statement, as I read, is full of false narratives, aided by Republicans on this committee who still refuse to release their own investigation transcripts. So, Mr. Chairman, if your findings are solid, release those transcripts now. The taxpayers who funded this work deserve transparency, not cherry-picked quotes that suit your sham narrative. And again, I ask that the transcripts, all of them, be made publicly so that the public can read and see everything, not cherry-picked sentences. Before two was fed into the wood chipper, USAGM and its broadcasters were reaching a record 427 million people weekly, delivering objective news to China, Iran, Russia, and other repressive states. Last year, VOA's Persian service recorded 223 million visits to its website, doubling over 4 years. It had 9.8 million social media followers and 1.8 billion Instagram views. Then, Ms. Lake, you put VOA Persian on leave in March, scrambled to restore it in June when war erupted, and inexplicably, a week later, announced mass firings. So the question is, which is it? Is USAGM and the work it supports unsalvageable waste, as you have said, or is it a critical tool for diplomacy and facts? What you're doing isn't efficiency, it's chaos. The dysfunction lies in the administration's allergy to truth and democracy, the two pillars that USAGM aims to promote abroad. So I'm not surprised by the choice to gut USAGM, since the first Trump administration targeted the enterprise, violating laws and journalistic integrity to shape it into a state media, like Russia's or North Korea's. Today, those regimes are actually cheering as we surrender another potent set of soft power tools and abandon the airwaves. The Trump administration, again, chose extremism over facts, tearing down rather than building up our information advantage? Will Congress defend USAGM and free media, or rubber stamp this capitulation to China, Russia, and Iran? Our adversaries are already filling the void. But it's not too late to savage USAGM. Not from itself, as Ms. Lake says, but from this administration's short-sighted hatchet job. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member for his comments. I'd say be careful what you wish for. Ms. Lake has provided binders and binders of information that have been included in her opening statement, so they are in the official record, and I'm sure everybody will looking forward to reading that documentation. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have the Senior Advisor for the U.S. Agency of Global Media, Ms. Kari Lake, before us today. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep your spoken remarks to roughly 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize you, Ms. Lake, for any opening statement that you may have.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Mast and Ranking Member Meeks and members of this House Foreign Affairs Committee. Thanks for having me. My name is Kari Lake. I'm the Trump Administration Senior Advisor to the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Before I get started, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to let you know this opening statement I'll be delivering is a shortened version of a longer version that I have submitted to you earlier and would love to be put into the congressional record. Last December, President-elect Donald Trump called me and asked if I would help reform U.S. Agency for Global Media and the Voice of America, and I said yes. I was honored and eager to help these institutions tell America's story to the world. But within days in my role as senior advisor, it became increasingly clear that reform was nearly impossible. The agency was incompetent and mismanaged and deeply corrupt, politically biased, and frankly, a serious threat to our national security. USAGM oversees VOA, Office of Cuba Broadcasting, and grantees like Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Middle East Broadcasting Network, Open Technology Fund, and Frontline Media Fund, all of which are 100% funded by the hardworking American people. Over the past 15 to 20 years, the agency has become a significant national security risk. They hire a shockingly high number of foreign nationals, and they conduct subpar security vetting, so bad that top intelligence agencies revoked this agency's ability to do even the most basic background checks. So many of USAGM's hires come from countries hostile to the United States. Over the decade from 2010 to 2020, Office of Personnel Management and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence repeatedly flagged severe security failures, but USAGM leadership ignored them. They continued to grant journalists and technicians, many from foreign nations, high-level security access based on falsified documents and incomplete background checks, phony names, phony social security numbers. Even after corrective actions were taken in the final months of the Trump administration, these safeguards were reversed by the incoming Biden administration. The scale of the problem is staggering. During the first Trump administration, the political appointees led by CEO Michael Pack got to work fixing it. And they discovered that out of 150 people who were hired during that time period when they weren't doing appropriate vetting, 500 of them were still out there and they could not find them. They went back and re-vetted everybody, but 500 had gone missing. They could not be located for further screening. Foreign employees with social security numbers that are fake and fake names given top secret access now missing. That keeps me up at night. My team is working to track them down. Our new security director is working to try to turn this agency around and make it where it's safer. It's a vast problem that we've uncovered. We've also uncovered that the grantees like Radio Free Europe hired people later identified as foreign spies. At one point, they nearly hired more than 20 spies from a nation hostile to America. Those hires were stopped thanks to a timely tip, and I'm happy to give you more information on that in a secure setting. Voice of America has employed individuals with direct ties to hostile nations. They even once paid paid for somebody who worked previously in Russian media writing anti-American stories to come on the staff and continue to write anti-American stories. At one point, a serious security threat to America, an Office of Cuba Broadcasting Cuba was declared to be a national security threat. He was fired, thankfully, but he worked there for quite some time. So how do they get so many foreign nationals in? Well, they abuse the J-1 visa program, which is a pathway to citizenship intended for exchange students and cultural exchanges, students, camp counselors, and au pairs. It's not intended for journalists, and it's created severe vulnerabilities, and frankly, it has displaced many, many American workers who could have filled these jobs. VOA also sidestepped their charter to be reliable, authoritative news, instead being riddled with political bias and outright anti-American sentiment. Examples, you mentioned it, Chairman, refusing to call Hamas terrorists, glamorizing Che Guevara, airing campaign-style videos favoring President Biden, even broadcasting a graphic depicting President Trump with a swastika over his face on their news. I wouldn't want that, by the way, even if it was President Biden. That's totally inappropriate. And a ridiculous editorial firewall prevents agency leadership like myself from correcting any of the bias or having any say in the editorial content that goes on the air. We've also got financial mismanagement, which I hope we'll go into. $75,000 spent for a COVID study on how Mac computers can be used for social distancing. $100,000 in American taxpayer money to actually sponsor an Afghan cricket team. $400,000 for quid pro quo payments to African VOA affiliates, and they actually wrote quid pro quo next to the budget item. $825,000 for a New York music show and $6 million contract for consulting advice that was never even implemented. I told these stories to people, and many times they say, wow, this place sounds like a crime scene. And I frankly have just learned that it is indeed a crime scene. We've learned that there is an active investigation going on at VOA for a series of threatening phone calls that have been coming out going after one of your colleagues, a sitting member of Congress, with years' worth of threatening phone calls, and they've discovered that those phone calls were coming from inside the Voice of America. This place is rotten. It's rotten to the core. President Trump has asked me to go in and help clean it up, and he's also issued an executive order to reduce this agency down to its mandate, to what is mandated, statutorily required. That's exactly what I'm doing. I don't care if they attack me. We're gonna make it right for the American taxpayers. And with that, I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lake, for your opening statements. We're now going to move to member questions. We ask that members keep their questions to 5 minutes. I'm going to begin by working down the line. I'll start by recognizing the Chairman Emeritus, Representative McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lake, thanks for being here today. I want to thank you for visiting with me in my office to talk about these challenges that you've outlined. I think the chairman has outlined them quite well. I want to commend you for reforming USAGM. I think every new administration has a right and responsibility to do so. Your testimony has highlighted systemic problems that must be addressed. More importantly, security lapses, misuse of visas, weak editorial oversight, and much more. I look forward to authorizing this agency with the chairman and his authorization bill to correct these abuses. I remember President Reagan used Voice of America when I was entering college as a frontline voices against Soviet oppression. It was a voice of America, not the voice of anti-America. Recently, I used the Voice of America and Open Technology Fund to translate my report on the origins of COVID-19. We disseminated it through mainland China, broke through the firewall. It went viral, got the attention of the CCP foreign minister who spoke out against me and the report. That's the kind of impact this agency needs to reach. With the events in Iran, we need America's voice in Iran right now. We need to ensure the Iranian people hear the truth, that we do not intend to harm them, but rather their oppressor and this theocratic regime of the Ayatollah. We need communications inside and outside of Iran. This week, General Vogel, the CENTCOM commander, said the Voice of America is a critical tool for American security. You've outlined why there are many insecurities. I hope we can go back to that core mission. My dad's war combating the Nazis. So my question is, Ms. Lake, how are you working to fix Voice of America so it is the voice of America and not anti-America in Iran, and use the Open Technology Fund to achieve the mission, the core mission that Congress intended?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for laying out when it was a better agency. You're right, Ronald Reagan used it, a great broadcaster, one of the great communicators, and he used it, but times have changed, and it's still doing 1990s style television in a world where people are getting their information right here on their smartphones. It's in the back pocket. And so we need to update it and modernize it. But President Trump's executive order dated March 14th has called for this agency to be brought to its statutory minimum. And I'm glad that you mentioned Iran, because one of the languages that is required in the statute is Farsi, and we are still broadcasting in Farsi. And Ranking Member Meeks said that we have not been, and that we, in a panic, started to put news out in Farsi. That is actually not true. We were in the process of effectuating President Trump's executive order, and in the process of doing that, several malicious lawsuits were started up, and the judge froze us from being able to get news on. We literally were frozen in place because of all of these lawsuits. Once we were freed to start putting news on, we immediately went to what the statutory minimum is, and one of the languages is Farsi going into Iran. And I'm very proud to say that when President Trump, when the bombings happened over the weekend on Saturday, and when President Trump started to speak, we had a crew in on Saturday delivering President Trump's message to the people of Iran in Farsi. It was translated and it went out. Sometimes a lean and mean and a smaller staff makes it easier to get things done. And in one of the emails that I got from our Persian team, they actually said that. They were able to move quicker because it was smaller, the bloat had been diminished. And I'm really proud of the fact that we got that on. We're going to continue to operate at the statutory minimum. We are putting out content in Pashto, Dari, Mandarin, Farsi, and Spanish through Office of Cuba Broadcasting.
I thank you for that response. I think it's very important right now that the Iranian people hear the American story and the American message, and I commend you for your efforts to reform. And I encourage you to get that message into Iran right now. Communication inside and out is so important for those people if they're going to rise up against this oppressive theocracy that we've endured since 1979. I yield back.
Recognize Ranking Member Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first enter into the record a letter that you and I received, Mr. Chairman, from 4 bipartisan members of the International Broadcasting Advisory Board, which Congress established and confirmed in 2023. Thank you. Now, Ms. Lake, you may recall the White House fired the board members earlier. Let me just first say this, because I do agree with Mr. McCall on the need of making sure that the voice of America in those places where our adversaries have false information going through. But you cannot do that simply by reducing and ending all individuals that are work within that agency. So now, these board members, for example, that were fired, despite their political and policy differences, those members wrote, and I quote, defunding, as you have done, these networks, because you can't do anything without money, but defunding these networks at this critical moment will undermine the United States' efforts to counter the biased narratives from America's authoritarian competitors. It's crucial. Some have said that it seems as though that our adversaries under this administration has been considered or treated like they're our allies, and our allies have been treated as if they're our adversaries. Now, I agree with the experts that put this letter in. There are grave risks right now for the United States national security posed by dismantling USAGM and the broadcasters it supports. Now, one of the things I want to do, maybe we can do this and it's trying to save some time. I serve on the Financial Services Committee also, where we often engage with companies about the risk analysis that they perform before making major business decisions to outpace their competitors. And I know I hear my Republican colleagues often say that government should be run like a business. So I just want to try to just get a few yes or no questions in the time that we have, just so that I know we can either get some of the information that the chairman said you are bringing or have brought with you. So my question to you is, did you conduct or review a written analysis before placing most of the USAGM's and VOA's employees on administrative leave on March 15th, before cutting off payments to USAGM grantees in March, or before announcing a reduction in force at the VOA last Friday? Yes or no?
I've been working in media for 30 years, and in every newsroom across this country in that time.
Yes or no? Did you do?
These are complex questions. They're not yes or no questions.
It's either you did a review or you didn't.
We are right-sizing an agency that has grown and grown and grown.
Did you do a review?
We've reviewed, yes, we've reviewed.
You've done a review. Do
We-
you have a
we have
record of? Do you
reviewed-
have a record of what you reviewed?
We have reviewed the number of employees, the number of languages, but most of all, what we reviewed was an executive order, March 14th, by the man who's in charge
Do
of
you
the
have?
executive branch.
I want to know.
His
I
name is
wanna know,
Donald Trump.
Do you have a record that you can produce? The chairman said you had a bunch of things with you. Do you have a record of what you reviewed and who you reviewed
Yeah,
to?
we reviewed the statute.
Do you have a record? Yes or no?
We have the statute, and
Do
we
you have a
reviewed
record?
the statute. Yeah, we can pull that statute
Or
for
if you have it, not the statute, the record of individuals that you reviewed, interviewed, or talked to before you committed your actions of dismantling.
I talked to a lot of people at the agency.
Do you have a record of that?
You could go back and look at emails.
Do you have a record?
Do you want me to pull emails?
I want you to show the record of what you did, Ms. Lake.
Well, you can
Don't
take a
just
look at
give
it.
me something that's not verified. Tell me, show me the record, because that's what I hear oftentimes in the business. You have to have a record. Show me the record that you did, what you did, that's all.
It's pretty obvious what we did.
Did you survey? Let me ask this question then. Did you survey employees that was there about waste, fraud, and abuse you believe was occurring at the agency? Did you survey?
We
Since you
know
said
that there's waste, fraud, and abuse.
Did you
There's been
survey the employees? Yes or no?
Why?
Yes or no?
These are ridiculous
Did
questions.
you serve? Simple answers. You either did or you didn't.
Yeah, I guess survey means talk
Did
to
you
and
do it
ask
or not?
questions. Sure, we did.
You did? Then you can provide those surveys. You can show us a record of who you
We
talked
did
to.
not run an expensive
Did you-
survey, but I've talked to many people at this agency.
You didn't do. So you didn't do that either. So this was based on a whim. Okay.
Ranking member time has expired. I want to thank you for your 5 minutes of questioning. I'm now going to recognize Representative Smith
Thank
for
you very
5
much.
minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the committee, Ms. Lake. I chair the Congressional Executive Commission on China. We've had many, many hearings. We've worked on legislation. One of my bills that passed just a few weeks ago was to combat the heinous practice of forced organ harvesting, where 50, 70,000 young people, average age 28, get their organs taken. They're Uyghurs, they're Falun Gong practitioners. It passed 406 to 1. Second time it passed last year as well. I've had 4 hearings on it. Xi Jinping is committing atrocities like almost no one else in the world. And whether it be what he's done to Hong Kong, the pervasive use of torture, religious persecution, everywhere you look, genocide against the Uyghurs. And then in your testimony, and I would ask you if you could maybe elaborate on this, you point out that the past leadership of VOA Mandarin Language Services conducted annual meetings with the Chinese embassy in Washington. Well, I go to the Chinese embassy myself, outside picketing. We try to meet. I've invited Chinese leaders here from the embassy and from the government many times to testify. Every time they turn us down. But if you could elaborate on those meetings, whatever you could tell us. You also pointed out that VOA's Mandarin language service personalities have hosted events at the Chinese embassy, And one of VOA's television editors even publicly pledged his allegiance to the PRC at a Chinese embassy event. And finally, you said VOA allowed the communist Vietnamese and Chinese embassies in D.C. to pressure them into removing videos, cutting short live interviews, or changing story angles so that coverage was more supportive of the Chinese governments of Hanoi and Beijing. If you could elaborate on that, I'd deeply appreciate it.
I'd be happy to, and I just actually read an article that was very interesting. It's called Chinese Influence at Voice of America. And I mentioned that there's a firewall, an editorial firewall, that members of the management at USAGM and Voice of America cannot tell the reporters what to report. They can't talk about what should be in the newscast. And so if a reporter decides to go rogue and do pro-CCP coverage, I can't do anything about it. That's not how a newsroom should be run. I've worked in newsrooms my whole life. There's always some editorial control that management has so that you're making sure that what goes out of the airway is accurate. And frankly, in an agency such as this, it should be telling America's story. That's our charter, telling America's story, being authoritative, not telling China's story. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what you just mentioned. If I may read this, because it was really shocking when I read this. And sorry, I got to put my reading glasses on for this one, guys. Starting in the first decade of the 2000s, the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., and the leadership of VOA's Mandarin service began an annual meeting to allow embassy officials to voice their opinions about VOA's content. So management at USAGM has no say in what content it goes on, but the folks over at the CCP and the Chinese embassy do have say about what goes on our air. CCP embassy officials have also reached out to VOA hosts to convince them to be more supportive of the regime. VOA personalities have hosted events at the embassy. VOA TV editor, one of them, publicly pledged his allegiance to China at a Chinese embassy event. This is absurd. This is insane, and the American taxpayers are footing the bill for this. You know, they also ran a 2-minute CCP propaganda. They produced it at VOA. And the management agreed that it was CCP propaganda. Frankly, 2 seconds of CCP propaganda is too much. The American people are footing the bill. And so things have to change there. We need to make sure that firewall is gone. We should be able to have control over what kind of content goes out. It should be in alignment with our foreign policy. And unfortunately, the only people that seem to have any influence are our adversaries on what is going out on VOA's airwaves. It's outrageous, and it has to stop. And thankfully, President Trump issued that executive order to bring this agency down to its statutory minimum, and he has called for this agency to be eliminated starting in the fiscal year 2026.
Well, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for highlighting that important complicity with the brutality of the Chinese Communist Party. You know, I'm barred from going to China. I used to lead human rights missions there frequently. The Global Times put me on their so-called hit list. And I can tell you, you know, I can't go to China, and yet we had people collaborating with their top leadership here in D.C. and elsewhere. And that is outrageous. We need to reform this, and I agree.
You can judge a man by his enemies, and you've got good enemies.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Representative yields back. Representative Keating is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. I think if we look at Exhibit A in terms of the value of global media, we look no further than Iran. The Trump administration took great attention towards the bombing that occurred. But to really be successful, what's going to be necessary is not just strong diplomacy, but changing the views of the people that live there. And Secretary Rubio in his Senate confirmation stressed that there's probably no greater discrepancy between the actions of one government and their people than Iran. And even before this action, before the war, 6.6 million Iranians, 10% of the adult population, got their news from FARDA, radio-free network that's there. And it's produced in an agency that you sought to terminate the contracts of at a time when it's needed more than ever. Cutting transmission feeds from the Middle East Broadcasting Network. It's resulted in 90%, those actions of yours, 90% of the staff being cut. Some of the people on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty are furloughed. Programming's been reduced at a time when we need it the most. I'm concerned also, not just with the cuts, but I'm concerned for the journalists that report this news. They're in great jeopardy. A lot of attention in your opening remarks went to vetting and the extreme efforts that you're doing for vetting. I want to know what you're doing to protect those journalists. One just recently released the other day, after 4 years of detainment by the Russians, talked about the way he was tortured and physically abused and psychologically abused. These are journalists that are there. These are people trying to bring the word of democracy to people that have not. What are you doing to support these journalists? What attention? I didn't notice it in your opening remarks. That should be first and foremost. What are you doing to protect these people?
I agree. I think the safety and security of journalists is very important. I was a journalist in my past profession, and so it's critically important, and I don't think that they've done enough to protect them. I'm thankful that recently, in the last few days, one journalist who was being held was released thanks to President Trump. And, you know, I think you need to ask RFE, Radio Free Europe, what they're doing to protect their employees. I just got to the agency 3 months ago, and what the question is,
I would like to know,
why are we
Madam,
hiring,
if I may, reclaiming my
why
time.
are we
I'm
hiring
reclaiming
more
my time.
Americans?
I'm reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's sort of like blaming the group that's advocating for these people. What are they doing? I'll tell you what they're doing. They've simply asked for a meeting with you.
It's hard to meet with somebody when they're suing you.
I have a letter that I'd like to ask unanimous consent be put in the record from the President of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the President of Radio Free Asia, the President of Middle East Broadcasting Networks, dated April 30th, simply asking for some kind of communications or meeting with you regarding these issues of detainment. I'd also like to put into the record an article that says audience in Iran and the Middle East surge as funding for Fatah and Allura amid East Israel is in jeopardy. If you look at what's happening, and you look what happened since the bombing occurred and since the war occurred, you just see dramatic increases in the listenership, just proving how vital this is to people that aren't getting other messages. Radio Fatah traffic surged 344%. The Instagram account, 62.5 million increases, a rise of 77%. These are things that are necessary, and you are cutting the agreements. Thank goodness the courts are saying no to you. But why would you ever want to do this here? Why would you not? Why do you better say, I want to know what Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is doing to protect the journalists, when the U.S. and you have a role in doing it, and you won't even take a meeting from the people that want to meet and discuss the dangers to these journalists. I hope that you will take that meeting, and we get a confirmation from you by the end of this hearing, that you will meet them soon and discuss these issues. People's lives are in danger trying to tell the truth. I yield back.
If they would drop their malicious lawsuit, I'd be happy to meet with them, but it would be really stupid to meet with someone who's suing you. And, you know, this is a gentleman who makes about $310,000, $320,000 off the backs of hardworking Americans, and is suing our agency. We've given him all.
An official who's making money off the backs of Americans when we have a commander-in-chief making the money he's making. So I don't.
President Donald Trump donates his salary back.
Gentleman yields back.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. This is submitted for the record. I was glancing through it, and just FYI, I'm going to keep reading it, but I don't actually see a request for a meeting with Ms. Lake in the letter, as was referenced. I see bring to her attention, but no request for a meeting in this letter. But I'll let you know if that changes as I read through it. Representative Perry is now recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lake, would you care to answer the question further, the last question further? Do you want to expound on any of that?
Well, I think it is difficult to meet with people when they're suing you. It just isn't advised. And if any attorney would tell you, you can't sit down and meet with somebody who's launched malicious lawsuits against the agency, naming me in those lawsuits. So it'd be ill-advised to do that, obviously. You know, we do not have a current grant agreement with RFE, Radio Free Europe. which was started, many, many years ago as a CIA operation, and we don't have a current grant agreement with them. We've been asking to work with them, negotiating a grant agreement, and they refuse. We offered a grant to them, and they refused to even mark it up and redline it and send it back to us. So we don't have an approved financial plan. They won't tell us where they're spending their money. We've got an audit going on right now, and they've stonewalled and prevented us from getting any access to their financial books. Again, we pay them, and they do not tell us where the money is going. I think that's a problem. I think the American people deserve to know where their money is going. And so we're working to make sure we get that. Interestingly, in the 11th hour last night, right before I crawled into bed, we found out that they're finally going to give a little bit of information to our auditors. I thought it was really interesting timing because they didn't want me to sit up here and say they refused to let us look at their books. They refused to let us see where the American taxpayer dollars are going and once it's getting funneled into RFERL. And if they really, we've paid them every month, by the way. So if they're not protecting their journalists, it's on them. If they're not putting out broadcasting, it's on them. We have paid them every month because the judges ordered us to, and so it's on them if they're not putting out broadcasting.
Ms. Lake, this is clearly an agency that is run amok. I wouldn't characterize it as treason, but it sounds like it's certainly seditious. Are you familiar with the McGuire-Woods report?
I'm very familiar, and it's in one of these binders, and it was an incredible report looking at some of the mismanagement, misuse of funds, and other outrageous things that were happening at this agency.
To that end, I just want to inform you that I struggled mightily, probably for about 6 months in this committee and in Congress, to have that entered into the congressional record so that the American people could see the misuses of their money and the seditious activity by an agency they were paying for. And I think as part of that, 40% of the workforce at that time was improperly vetted, and USAGM lost their ability to conduct security clearances, but continued to conduct them for 10 years after which they had lost their ability to conduct security clearances, and that the use of J-1 visas to hire foreign journalists and technical staff without systematic review resulted in propaganda that was favorable to adversaries and enemies as opposed to the United States of America with American tax dollars, paid for with American tax dollars. Now, somebody might say, well, that was a mistake, and yeah, that was a misstep, but it seems to me this was an orchestrated plan by someone at USAGM. And so my question begins with, have we determined from the McGuire-Woods report or any of your investigation at this point who, by name, authorized this activity over that long period of time, and these people antithetical to the United States of America? Who did that, and what accountability has been put in place? What prosecutions have happened as a result of that? What accountability has taken place, if any?
Sadly, there hasn't been any accountability. That McGuire-Woods report was done in the waning days of President Trump's first term. Michael Pack was the CEO, and he helped make that possible. He saw, the first day on the job, he got dropped on his desk this issue with 1,500 employees had not been properly screened. And he said, this is a real big problem. ODNI was saying, you got a serious problem over there. You guys are freelancing on your security screenings, and you're allowing dangerous people into our country. And so they got busy investigating how this was happening. They put people on administrative leave, and before they could do anything and fire people, people had left that were being investigated. When the Trump administration ended and Biden went into office and replaced the leadership at this agency, they rehired all of those people back.
So let me,
and gave
I
them
don't mean to
settlements
cut
of
you off, Ms. Lake, but I've
$650,000.
got a limited amount of time. Of course, this is completely outrageous, but why should anybody in this country, anybody in this committee, anybody in Congress believe that this agency, this operation should continue to exist and won't return to its former operations and activities beyond the Trump administration and beyond your tenure? Why should anyone believe that?
They shouldn't believe it, and I think this is why President Trump wants to eliminate the agency. The agency itself is not needed. It's proven that it does not know how to manage and does not know how to be respectful of this country and the American taxpayers' dollars. And so I think President Trump is absolutely right in eliminating this agency. We can roll in things that are valuable, that are worthwhile, bring it under the Department of State, where it once was, by the way. Voice of America, back when it was effective, back when many of you talk about the glory days of Voice of America, it was under the Department of State, where there were guardrails on the story of America was being told. It wasn't anti-American, it was in line with our foreign policy, and I think that's where it probably should end up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman yields, and your time expired. Chair now recognizes Representative Barra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to enter into the record a letter dated yesterday from the president of the News Guild, just asking this committee to take a look and make sure the funds that are supposed to be restored actually get restored to the grantees. Thank you. You know, here's what bothers me about this. Reforms are fine and so forth, but you know, I agree with my good friend from Texas, the Chairman Emeritus, Mr. McCall, about the importance of having tools like the Open Technology Fund that can translate, use the internet, use Instagram, et cetera, to get out there and get our message to places like China, et cetera. I agree with Chairman Smith. I mean, we've got to speak to the Chinese people about what's happening to the Uyghur population. We've got to have those tools. So eliminating those tools wholesale make us weaker as a country. That is a problem. And in fact, our Secretary of State penned an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal back in 2018 talking about how important what Radio Free Asia does is in exposing China's campaign against its Muslim minorities, the Uyghurs. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter that op-ed into the record, if I might. So here's the challenge. The ranking member raised, I think, what is a very important issue. You know, we can debate, you know, whether this, say, an independent agency come back into the State Department or not, but the wholesale way of dismantling this agency, I think the chairman asked a legitimate question. What was the strategy? What was there a methodical approach to looking at the agency? What was effective? What was not effective? What should we be doing? What should we not be doing? Ms. Lake, can you provide kind of that methodical approach in terms of how the administration, how you looked at, you know, what essentially is a dismantling of this agency?
Yeah, we actually got to work after the 14th of March, and we put people on administrative leave and assessed what the statutory minimum was.
Can you provide us documentation of that so we can do our job as
Yeah,
oversight?
I mean, in meetings and in discussions, we talked about
the
what
minutes of those meetings and, you know, the documentation of that.
It would be emails and things of the such.
That's all stuff that we can take a look at as a committee as we do oversight. Again, I'm not against modernizing the agency. I'm not against looking at things. The challenge Mr. Keating touched on, you know, we're in the middle of what is a war in the Middle East. Hopefully this ceasefire holds. Hopefully the Iranian people rise up and demand a better future. You know, I've reserved judgment on the president's actions. I do want the administration to come brief us on what they're thinking, how this is unfolding. But absolutely, right now, we need all of our tools to communicate to the Iranian people. We need to do that through the radio, through the internet, through Instagram. I'm not a big TikTok fan. Yeah, I supported the TikTok ban. But if folks are getting information on TikTok, we've got to be using that as well. I am very concerned that the personnel have been laid off, that, you know, we're working with a shoestring staff that is making us weaker and less effective at a moment of vulnerability for the Iranian regime, where this could be a time where the Iranian people choose to take a different path forward. What I would like to do, and what I'd like a commitment to do, and I'd ask the chairman for this, is there was a time on this committee where we actually did do reforms. When I was a freshman member of Congress under Chairman Ed Royce, at that time ranking member Elliot Engel, we actually did do a bipartisan reform bill that I believe passed this committee unanimously and moved forward. That's our job. Ms. Lake, you should be working with us. We should not be dismantling an agency that we've seen over history has been super effective, whether it was in World War II, combating the Nazis in the Cold War, going against the repressive Russian or Soviet Union and the Communist Party. What I think the administration's doing and how they've approached this is making us weaker. And it is not a systematic way of thinking about how you reform and modernize things. I'd love to see the records, the minutes, the emails, so we can actually do our job in oversight. And I'd love for you to work, and Mr. Chairman, for us to work together in a bipartisan way to say, okay, in the 21st century, we do need tools to combat the propaganda that our enemies are putting out there. We do need to hire the best folks. We do need to have all of that. Again, Ms. Lake, I'd love your commitment to work with this committee, work with Congress to enact those reforms and share the information and what you're thinking.
Absolutely. It would be wonderful to work with you and to effectuate the president's executive order to reduce this agency down in size so that it's lean, mean, and effective. And I think it is effective. We were able to get information out into, and translated into Farsi as to what was happening. We were able to get President Trump's address translated live as it was happening. You don't need a massive staff. This is the only newsroom in the world that hasn't seen cutbacks because we don't need to have massive newsrooms.
Again,
15,000 people.
Right now, what I worry about, though, is we've let go of all this staff, and it isn't happening, and it's only happening.
We haven't
with
let go of
some
all
people.
the staff, actually.
Gentleman's time has expired.
By the way, can I just mention something? I want to show you the newsroom, one of the newsrooms over at VOA. I don't know if you can see this. Empty. It's kind of a Where's Waldo. Can you spot the one person in there?
Not from here.
One person in the newsroom. And I know you're probably saying, yeah, thanks a lot, Kari. No, this was actually back during the Biden administration. I didn't hear any complaints coming from anybody when nobody was showing up for work at VOA, when one person was showing up in the middle of the week. One person showed up. And nobody on this committee, no Democrat said, why is there only one person in that newsroom? We need to get more people in the newsroom to get the story out. Nobody was showing up for work. And now that we are actually right-sizing an agency that has been bloated out of control and has never been right-sized, even though newsrooms all across this country.
Mr. Chairman?
Now I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, unanimous consent, just for clarification. Was that in the middle of COVID, by the way?
This was last November. So I think COVID was over.
Good question.
But the elections were, maybe it had something to do with the elections.
Well, I think you'd want to be in there if there was election. This is the middle of the week in November. I've been in newsrooms, they're actually really full during an election. But I know this newsroom was ready to attack President Trump. They were doing ads for Joe Biden. They were literally running Joe Biden ads
Mr. Chairman?
and
Whose time is
attacking
this?
President Trump.
Whose time is this?
Well, Mr. Keating just wanted a moment to ask a question, so I think she's responding to that.
I think it's
You're welcome
cutting
for
into
giving
your
more
time,
time.
Mr.
You're
Chairman.
welcome for giving more time to your side. Appreciate more questions like that.
Mr. Chairman, like the gentleman, I have a clarification question.
Please.
If it was the middle of November, then to the gentleman's point, it was after President Trump had won, and those people were out because they were in mourning, because they were so partisan that they wanted to not be there. And I think he made a very good point, and I thank the gentleman.
We digress.
Can I actually just respond to that really quickly?
I am actually going to recognize myself for 5 minutes now, as much as it's been a fun exercise with everybody. I would make the point that, radio free is not free. And I was just thinking about this in my office the other day, and I was like, what's the most common media in America on the radio? I think it's iHeartRadio, iHeartMedia. The entire budget for iHeartMedia across the breadth of the United States of America and the globe is $90 million. Wow. That's the entire breadth. For Radio Free Europe, $150 million, significantly more than all of iHeartMedia. For Radio Free Asia, $70 million. For Middle East broadcasting, $103 million. You think of all of those individually, and you compare that to iHeartMedia across America, and you look at the reach of that. I just think it's an interesting note as we point out the need to downsize the size and scope of what's going on in USAGM. I did want to do my questions right now because I wanted to touch a little bit on what Representative Perry had spoken about with that IG report, but I am very surprised that nobody touched off on this on either side of the aisle. It was just said by you in your opening remarks that there's a member of Congress targeted by somebody inside of USAGM. Does that mean you were tracking their IP address and they were emailing people or they were phone calling? How do you track that? What do you mean?
Well, you'd have to ask the Capitol Police. They're the ones, I believe, doing the investigation, and it's an active investigation. But from my understanding, somebody was calling a beloved member of Congress who's actively in Congress right now. And
Republican or Democrat?
I'm going to let you guess. With the bias you've seen at this agency, just take a wild guess.
Can you say the name of the
Republican.
individual that conducted this?
I think I would prefer to withhold that, and maybe we can talk away from this because I don't want to sabotage the investigation.
Will you keep us updated on it as the
I
investigation
will
goes
as I
on?
learn more. From what I've learned is that over the course of 2 years, I believe starting in roughly October of 2023, right up until January of 25, threatening phone calls were being made to a sitting member of Congress. And through the course of their investigation, they figured out where those calls were. I don't know how our investigators figured that out, but they have ways, and they found out that the phone calls to the sitting member of Congress, threatening calls, were coming from inside of VOA.
Thank you for sharing. We look forward, I'm sure all of us on both sides, to hearing more information about this. I want to get to the questions about the IG reports. And it's something that I spoke about in my opening statements. Individuals hired on, improperly vetted, some of these agencies asking for their own SCIFs, their own secure places to view classified information, and not literally always being given security clearances, but given access to secret and top secret information. It's amazing to me to think that journalists were given what we might not give allied militaries. That to me is a very interesting thing to think about. But when you say we couldn't find 500 of these individuals, you mean somewhere in the government you went to go look for who are these people that you consider suspect, and now they pulled a Kaiser Sose and we can't see them anywhere? What's going on?
Sadly, yes. About 1,500 people went through this shoddy vetting, which I think could have been intentionally shoddy, and because they knew there were problems. This is no fingerprints, aliases in
No
many
FBI
cases.
fingerprints or something like that.
Some of the times the FBI fingerprints were taken and not submitted. Sometimes they were not taken at all. And then they were given PIV cards, which is the access card you need to get into federal buildings and offices. It's actually a very secure way of keeping our offices and our departments and
Somebody's hired
agencies
by
safe.
America, they have a direct deposit. They have, like you said, an ID card to get into a building. If they're global media, they might have a passport to travel on behalf of the United States of America. The fact that you're saying these individuals cannot be found is a staggering statement.
Not only can they not be found, and we've asked for help with other agencies to try to track them down. We even asked the Doge guys. You know, these are young guys who have a way of kind of looking into things, and they said, I think we can find them. They tried and tried and tried.
Did they use aliases? I mean, were these people
a lot
using
of people
fake
use-
names?
Yes,
Okay.
when they come in.
Did they have social security numbers, or were they foreigners?
They're foreigners with no
on
social
visas?
security numbers, so they're given just a notional number was put in on these forms. They had forms that were not filled out. I mean, this is a massive security failure in a level that should keep you up at night.
I want to ask you one more question.
And they could be working, by the way, at
I
other
want to
agencies.
get to one more question before my time expired. Like you said, you were a big part of media in your prior roles. Did you ever have a TS or SCI clearance, or did you ever get to go into a SCIF as a member of the media?
No.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Sherfless McCormick.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Lake, for being here. I do have major concerns about the role that VOA plays, especially since as recently as a few months ago, there were over 427 million people who were actually being exposed to VOA, and VOA is usually one of the best places that we can provide fact-based and objective information to audiences, especially in China and Iran. Especially with the escalation that we're seeing in Iran and with lack of any kind of intelligence briefing, we want to get more information as far as what's actually going on in Iran and in the information we're providing them. But what I wanted to bring to your attention is a letter that we have here that I wanted to admit for the record. And it is from Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Middle East Broadcasting Network. And what they're pretty much saying is that they tried several times to reach you.
Pass it on back.
I
I'm gonna
think
read
I've
it.
already
The last
expressed
one
why I
didn't have
haven't
a
met with him,
request.
because we're in
I
active
just want to read it to
litigation.
you first, 'cause I want to give you the opportunity.
Okay.
I do believe that foreign affairs, especially when it comes to national security, shouldn't be a bipartisan, shouldn't be a partisan issue. I do believe that. And I want to give you the opportunity to just explain, because as one of my colleagues mentioned, there was a letter in April where they said they haven't met with you. And in this letter, they're saying that they've tried to meet with you and that Ms. Lake has not spent a single minute with us or our senior team. She has not visited our office or inspected our operations. And so with this letter that we have here that clearly says it, I also want to bring to your attention where it says also that they're still open to meeting with you. And I know now you're saying you can't meet with them, but I want to get more clarification. Within the 2 weeks that you were in your position, that you declared that it was you said specifically that's largely incompetent, corrupt, biased, and a threat to America's national security. What were the procedures in place for you to make that determination? Specifically, how much staff was actually allocated to do that investigation to help you come to that conclusion?
Well, we've got reports, we've got years of biased reporting, we have misused funds.
So could you tell me about the step or the mechanisms that you used? How much staff was provided to look into it in those 2 weeks to get to that?
How much staff is what?
How much staff? Like, what was your mechanisms in actually going through to coming to this conclusion within 2 weeks?
Within 2 weeks, I assessed all of the grant agreements, and I realized that these grant agreements had been changed during the Biden administration to take out any form of transparency. During the first Trump administration, the grant agreements were written where we had transparency, we could see what was being spent, and during the Biden administration, they took all of that transparency out, and then they signed a $250 million lease on a high-rise building, saddling the American people with paying for it, and it wasn't even equipped to do broadcasting.
Well, I'm happy you mentioned transparency, because that's where I'm trying to get also. Now, when you spoke to them, or if you had anybody speak to them, was there a conversation for accountability and transparency? I think that's what we're trying to get to. What was the mechanisms in place to come to these conclusions? And before the lawsuit was filed and these letters were sent, was there anybody who went to them to ask questions and hold them accountable? Was
It's
that done?
really hard to have a open communication when you're being sued.
Well, before that, because we have letters back until April. This one was in June. So before any lawsuits were filed, were there any attempts to have that
I
communication?
believe when I first got there, they reached out to me. I had just gotten in the building and said, we'd like to meet. And before I even had the chance to clear my schedule and meet with them, they launched into malicious lawsuits. So no, we haven't met with them.
If you can submit any communications that your office has had, I would greatly appreciate that. And my second question is, I do believe in lean, mean machines that work well. What are your matrices that you have in place to determine that the leanness is actually being beneficial and that this leanness is not creating a vacuum in which now we're not able to exercise our strongest power, which is our soft power and our diplomacy?
Well, it's one thing if it's used properly, but it hasn't been used properly. We laid out that the CCP has more say in what editorial content we have.
I only have 43 seconds. I want to know what those matrices are. What are the points that you're using to determine that this is actually benefiting, like this machine is working, versus adversely hurting us and creating a vacuum in which any other group can come in and put out propaganda? And we know there's a lot of propaganda, especially coming from the internet. So I want to make sure that we actually have a plan in place, there's funding in place, or that there are matrices in place to determine that this lean creation of a machine is actually working for us and not against us.
That's what our goal is. We want to make sure any information going out is not anti-American, is not pro-CCP.
So if there is a matrices, could you please provide it to us so we could be on the same page?
I wish we did have some say over what information was going out, but unfortunately, because of this firewall, this place could go totally rogue. This place could go and put 100% pro-CCP information. They could side with the regime in Iran, and we couldn't do a thing about it. They could run an attack piece on you.
I understand. Thank you so much, and I just want
And
to
you couldn't do anything about it.
The gentlelady's time has
I just want to
expired.
take, if you can allocate me just 1 second so I can say this, because I think it's very
The
important.
gentlelady had 5 minutes. Be brief.
I thank you for being here, and this is really the objective of us working together and coming together and negotiating how can we move forward. Right now, we're at a critical juncture where we see more and more hostilities, especially in these areas. And so we want the answers to these questions so we can work together. That
Thank
is
you. The
truly
gentlelady's time has really expired.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Self.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on the previous conversation on the security clearances, I want to go to Iran, back to Iran. In June of this year, you restarted broadcasts to Iran after Israel attacked them. In the meantime, Musk has said that the beams are on with Starlink into Iran. Industry estimates that there are 20,000 terminals, and you have to have a terminal yet. They're still testing cell phones operating in Iran through the black market channels. So I want to compare the two. Approximately how many Iranians currently watch the VOA Persian service?
Probably not that many, to be honest. The ratings aren't particularly good, and I don't know if you've ever had a chance to sit down and watch VOA programming. It's painful to watch.
Yeah, the RFE and RL have claimed that they reach millions of Iranians. Obviously, given your response, how are we going to support broadcast into Iran then, is the bottom line. I'll jump over some of this because I think it's not going to be answerable. What format do you see going into the most constrained countries? How are we going to do that? Because technology is changing fast.
Absolutely.
So, you know, we can call it radio, free whatever, but how do you plan to get pro-American, the American story into the most denied countries? And we'll start with Iran.
You know, I think Starlink is a great option. And when a lot of people have mentioned OTF and that's the way to go. But to be honest, they're behind the times. You know, they're looking at VPNs. And when a dictator turns off the internet, good luck. I mean, you've got to have a way to get information in. I think that Starlink is a great option. I would like to see Starlink moving a little bit faster into Iran so we can get the word out. We have an opportunity right now to let the people of Iran know that we don't have a problem with the people of Iran. They're incredible people. They have been mistreated for many decades. And we want to make sure that they know that America is a friend.
Yeah, and I think the high tech, you need to be examining how you're going to get around the government.
That's right.
How are you going to actually get the beam into the country, into the denied countries?
I will say though, with our programming that we put out on Saturday, I think it was the most watched we've ever put into Farsi, and it was through modes of people were actually seeing it. And they were watching, so they're very in tune to what's happening in America right now.
They are, but the government will then respond and cut it off if possible. So you've got to stay one step ahead of them. This is the age-old, how do you stay ahead of the enemy, the adversary? So what obstacles do you see in today's climate in getting into the big four, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran? What obstacles do you see and how do you plan to overcome them with this new organization that you are going to be developing?
Well, we would like to continue to put information that is accurate to the folks in those. And as I mentioned, we're reaching 4 languages, actually Pashto, Dari, Mandarin, Farsi, and in Cuba as well. And it's difficult. You know, we're still using radio and Radio Marti in South Florida.
Sure.
That seems to be working, but we're not reaching that many people with this. And I think we have to examine if it's worth the money that's going into this to be not reaching that many people. There's other ways to reach people than, like I said, 1990s style television. And I think that's, you can look at Twitter, you can look at social media. I mean, do you think for 1 minute that some of the Democrats have said, oh, China's rushing in and they're filling the vacuum? They're not doing 1990s television. They're laughing. As a matter of fact, they're not only laughing at what we were doing, they were controlling what we were doing by having more of a say of what our content was than we did. They're seeding narratives on TikTok, on Twitter. If we really want to be effective in changing the narrative, it's narrative seeding on social media. It's not 1990s style TV with a bloated staff of many people who actually hate America.
That's exactly right. And my whole point in this questioning is you're going to have to move fast to stay ahead of the technology.
Right.
Because it is changing fast, and I just recommend you do a scrub on how you're going to stay ahead of it, because we've got to get American information into these countries. It is a great help. It helped under the Soviet Union and denied countries. We've got to do that. My time has expired. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
your answers.
Thank the gentleman.
back.
The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Stanton. is
Thank you very
recognized
much,
for 5
Mr.
minutes.
Chair. Ms. Lake, your actions as senior advisor are eroding American soft power around the globe. We should not be dismantling the agency that combats propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party, the Kremlin, and Tehran. Especially now, we need to be able to broadcast facts that counter Iranian state-run media spin that is essential to America's long-term interests. Your job is to tell the people of the world the truth about America. And because of that, there's a more fundamental issue I want to address today, and that is character. You see, Ms. Lake, we have both been public figures in Arizona for a long time. I've seen you in action, including your behavior in the last 2 elections. And let me be clear about something. The American people cannot believe a word you say. You ran for governor in Arizona in 2022. You lost fair and square. Instead of conceding, you embarrassed yourself and our state by lying again and again for years, blaming everything under the sun for your loss except for your own toxic politics. You lie about that election to this very day. You lied about signatures on mail-in ballots not matching those on file. Proven wrong. You lied about ballots being intentionally misprinted and then rejected in Republican areas. Total BS. You lied and said hundreds of thousands of ballots were mishandled. Zero evidence. You claimed fake ballots were snuck into batches before they were counted. Come on. You repeated these lies again and again, and you've said even recently, quote, "I am the duly elected governor. They just stole it," unquote. Give me a break. Ms. Lake, your new role requires you to tell the truth. For decades, whenever authoritarians and dictators suppress the people and claim victory in fraudulent elections, Voice of America countered those lies. I can't imagine how people fighting for democracy today and around the world can trust someone who has so shamelessly lied about her own election.
Will the gentleman yield to
Ms.
the
Lake,
question?
no, I will not.
Okay,
Ms.
well,
Lake,
just so you
to
know,
regain a
VOA
semblance of
wanted
your
to not
credibility, I
call
will not
Hamas
yield.
terrorists, so
Ms. Lake,
if we're
to
gonna
regain a
berate the
semblance of
witness,
your
we may as well be
credibility.
factual about the
Are
evidence.
you,
The
I did not-
gentleman's
I did not-
time, if you did not yield, you
I
may
did not yield,
continue.
and I'd like the time back. Ms. Lake, to regain a semblance of your credibility, are you finally ready to admit you lost the 2022 Arizona election?
It saddens me that you are from Arizona and you're okay with
It's
the
a
way
yes or no question, Ms.
saddens
Lake.
me that you are from
I
Arizona.
guess the answer is no, reclaiming my time.
The gentleman
I-
will suspend, will stop the clock. For all present, members are reminded to avoid engaging in personality toward the president and other members. Okay, and this is a member of the administration, so I would caution all to stay on the subjects and stay off of personalities,
Would love to.
please. Gentleman may continue.
Yes, and in this case, these are adjudicated lies. Courts of law have determined that these are lies. These are not me saying it. You didn't
Wow,
just
and the
lie to
courts-
the
the
press.
courts are really
You
awesome
took
right
those
now.
lies to court and lost again and again. Every one of your lawsuits failed. And a federal judge said that you were furthering false narratives that blamelessly undermine public trust. And you didn't just lie, you were formally sanctioned by the court. Ms. Lake, you have been sanctioned twice for providing false information to courts. Isn't that true, yes or no?
I was brave enough to fight our shoddy elections, and the courts have not caught up.
That was a yes or no. I guess the answer is no. Let me reclaim my time. You have been sanctioned by both
What?
the
I can
United
tell-
States District Court and the Arizona Supreme Court for, quote, making false factual statements to the court. And you were sued for defamation by a Republican election official, Stephen Richer. He and his family were subjected to harassment and even death threats because of those lies. You told your supporters, Richer and fellow Republican County Supervisor Bill Gates, that they, quote, sabotaged Election Day. You accused them of deliberately printing the wrong image on ballots to jam tabulators and injecting hundreds of thousands of phony ballots. What a joke. And here's the thing, Ms. Lake. When it came down to it, you chickened out. You refused to defend those lies in court. You decided to take a default judgment. You are an adjudicated liar and a two-time political
Chairman, I move to
loser
take down
in
those
Arizona.
those
I have
words,
one
please.
final question.
Chairman,
Reclaiming my time.
I'd like
I
to
have one
take
final
down
question.
those
I'm not gonna
words.
yield.
It's the
gotta
gentleman's
get his
I do not
fundraising
yield.
video.
I have one final question
Get your
for you,
fundraising
Call
Ms.
someone
Lake.
a
You have
liar.
a chance
That's
to
not
answer.
how
Let me
you
one
treat
final
other
question.
people that
The
are being
gentlelady
questioned.
will suspend, please. Go ahead, you may
You
continue.
lost for governor in 2022 to Katie Hobbs. You lost even worse to Ruben Gallego for Senate in 2024. Well, Arizona has another election for governor next year. Will you do us all a favor and run it back and run for governor again? I yield.
The gentlelady
No more questions.
Can I
respond.
respond
You may
to some of
respond.
that? Because that was complete insanity. I wish I could yield back the last 5 minutes of my life, actually. And I want to apologize to the people of Arizona that we have somebody who's representing the folks in one of our great parts of the valley that doesn't care about the integrity of our election. So but you weren't here, you came in late, and we're talking about USAGM today, the Agency for Global Media, and how they can put out absolute abject lies, and we can't control any, we have no say over what the editorial content is, and I would hope that you would not be okay with that. They could literally put out a lie about anybody here, and I know you've been the victim of that. I know you've been the victim. I remember the stories about you where they said you had a gay lover, and those were going out all
Mr.
over.
Chairman.
Can I
I
finish
hope
the
you
story?
honor what you just gave as a caution to everyone, and I moved those words be
To tell you that those kind of lies, and you said those
rule if
were
you want.
lies, those kind of lies could be broadcast today on VOA, and you couldn't pick up the phone, Representative Stanton, and call them and say, hey, you're putting out lies about me. You would not be able to do that because they would sue you for breaking the firewall. So lies are being told on Voice of America. It's inappropriate. You've been subjected to lies that you said were lies about you in the media before. And how would you like it if those lies were put on Voice of America right now? Because they could do it, and you couldn't do a thing about it. You couldn't stop it. You couldn't stop all those lies that you said were said about you if they went on Voice of America today. You'd have to sit and take it.
Okay, I thank the gentlelady, and I appreciate the dialogue. Ruling on the member, she was responding, and I thought rather complimentary that, in fact, those were untrue, and she was defending that. So
That's what he says.
I'll leave it as that. I think Mr. Stanton would agree that those were untrue statements, and she said so. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes.
Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman.
I apologize. I wasn't concerned at all what she was saying. My concern is that the leader of this agency, which is supposed to disseminate truth about the United States, is an adjudicated liar. That's not an exaggeration. That's not.
Okay, the gentleman made that point quite clearly.
Said that, and
Mr.
that's why I brought it up.
Chairman.
Recognizing myself for
Mr.
5
Chairman,
minutes. the
unanimous
gentleman-
consent. Twice so far, the chair, prior to you, had said there was no documentation for requests of
Does the
meetings. So
gentleman
I'd like
want to submit
unanimous
something?
consent that these be placed in the record. These are requests for meetings that have not been answered. Thank you, Mr.
Could I
Chairman.
see the date on those? I mean, were the,
Okay, we'll be able to make
Okay.
the record complete, and you'll be allowed to give the other half of these emails. For the record, we agree, for unanimous consent, that these emails be entered and considered factual with the recognition that they be verified by the agency. I'll now recognize myself, and I'll be brief in saying, if everyone on the dais had the accusations of their opponents, or even, quite frankly, sometimes the legal battles, all of us would have a bad day here. That is part of politics. But we're not here to discuss politics today. We're here to discuss the spending of hundreds of millions of dollars and a question of whether or not it was best spent on behalf of the American people. You said earlier that, that in fact, there were 500 people unaccounted for who received payment in money at the taxpayer's expense. Is that correct?
they did while they were employed, and then they left the agency, and we can't track them down.
Okay, and without speculating per se, but just factually, can you verify that those people, since there's no fingerprints, no pictures, can you verify that these people existed and those were true identities?
True identities, I don't know. We can't.
Can you verify
But
that
they
they
did
came
exist,
to
they
work
were-
every day and performed duties?
I don't have that information.
So it is certainly possible that this independent third-party agency that you gave money, that previously were giving money to, in fact, had ghost employees or employees that the money ended up being conduited to other people. Is that possible?
It's possible.
And so on behalf of this committee and the American people, an audit is appropriate, isn't it?
I definitely believe it is, and we're in the process of doing an audit right now.
Okay, and if you fail to get the cooperation in the audit, please come back to the committee, because I think you'll see that we're willing to take further steps to support that need for an audit.
We have been stonewalled in the audit. The grantees, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting, and I mentioned OTF, have not wanted to give us any information, stonewalled, prevented it. We started this weeks ago, and as I said, just finally, last night, on the eve of this hearing, they finally said, okay, you can come in and start looking at our books.
We get similar promises on our subpoenas in some of the committees here. Let me ask a differing question. This money to a third-party agency over which you have arguably little control based on the history, do you give money to Al Jazeera?
No.
Do you give money to Pravda, which is Russian for the word truth?
No.
Okay, why don't you?
Obviously, because those are propaganda machines of, in many cases, our enemy.
Because they're adverse to the interest of the United States of America. So, by definition, whatever becomes the new, hopefully consolidated and concise and effective organization, in fact, should do one thing, which is promote the legitimate interest of the United States, including the truth as we see it.
Absolutely. That's what we should be doing. That's what we have been doing, and we haven't been doing it well. And I'm going to work really hard to make sure that whatever we salvage from this, it's telling America's story. We have an incredible story to tell. And especially right now, as we're working for peace around the globe with a president like Donald Trump.
And speaking of peace around the globe, you're familiar with the controversy that Chairman Mast had with the agencies when he was subcommittee chairman. And all he really wanted was them to explain why they wouldn't say Hamas terrorist after the October 7th attack, and instead used words more, quote, moderate to the base. Can you assure us that in the future, that if the President of the United States, at that time Joe Biden, the Secretary of State, et cetera, have an aligned policy and statement which is supported by the Congress, that in fact the messaging would be the messaging of the American people through its representatives and not some independent third idea of what you should say to be moderate?
Well, Congressman, I wish I could assure you of that, but unfortunately with this editorial firewall, it's impossible for us to have any say over the content, which is terrible.
In closing, because this committee is going through a structural reform of all of the State Department and its agencies, which will include yours, is it fair to say that going forward, we should in fact have a single point of contact, responsible and responsive, accountable and auditable, and that in fact it should be one in which there is, at least to the oversight of Congress and the administration, verifiable that these people are employed and working to the interest for which they have been hired?
I'm afraid we're never going to find those 500 people. They've escaped.
No, I'm talking about going forward. Can we reauthorize under the State Department reauthorization an organization that you can believe in, whether it's within the State Department or not? Can we do so? And do you see that as the goal for which President Donald Trump gave you the responsibility to do and you're working on?
Yes, and I believe it needs to be rolled into the State Department because President Trump has asked that we delete this agency. And so whatever we can salvage that's worthwhile should be brought under the Department of State, under the public diplomacy arm of the Department of State.
I look forward to, and this committee looks forward to working with you through the reauthorization process to find a win-win that some of the members on both sides have talked about today. With that, it's my pleasure to recognize my colleague, the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, we're in a discussion here where there's a lot of agreement to disagree. And I happen to think that the efforts
that Voice of America and its international broadcasting and its expansion post-World War II, along with the efforts to deal with Cuba broadcasting radio and TV. There's a whole list of, I think, successes over the post-World War efforts that we've been engaged in with the communist countries in which we have been able to tell the real story about America. Now, if you want to make modifications, reforms, I think this committee is an appropriate place to do that oversight. Having said that, I'd like to specify a particular area that deals with Armenia and the voice of Armenia. Do you happen to know, Ms. Lake, I come from the land of William Saroyan, and I assume you know what language the Armenian people of Armenia speak?
I've actually heard it. It's a beautiful language. I can't name it. Can you please tell me?
Yeah, it's Armenia.
Trick question.
The story of Armenian language is, and the voice of Armenia was so that the people of Armenia would understand, who were under the oppression of the Soviet Union, what America stood for and what our values stood for. How many people work at the Voice of America on their Armenian services? Do you know?
Right now, it's not a statutorily required language, so we do not have, we will not be having
Let me
employees
tell you,
in that.
because you had all these cuts that I don't think are surgical. They've been done with a, I think, some sort of disregard for, you have 5 people, you had 5 people, 1 full-time staffer and 4 contractors. They've all been placed on leave since March of this year. Did you or former fellow Elon Musk talk to anyone about the Voice of America's Armenian service before these cuts were made?
We are bringing the agency to statutory minimum, and Armenian language is not in the statutory minimum. If you'd like it to be, then I suggest you write legislation and put it in legislation.
What analysis was done to assess the performance of the services before the cuts were made?
We decided to listen to the person who's in charge of the executive branch of the government, and that person's name is President Donald J. Trump.
I suspect that maybe the president's not sure about the language that the Armenian people speak, but that be as it may, the Voice of America's own data showed that the Armenian language reached well over 1/3 of Armenia's adult population and ranked second in network-wide market penetration. The Voice of America brief notes said that the service unique role in countering the Russian disinformation and explaining U.S. policy to Armenians at the moment when Yerevan is trying to move out of Moscow's orbit. There are a lot of reasons why I think this is important because of the Russian disinformation. Do you believe that Russia's been engaged in disinformation with Armenia or other countries on Eastern Europe?
Obviously, you have a soft spot in your heart for Armenia. I think the people of Armenia are incredible. But we're working to right-size this agency, and the Armenian language is not one of the statutory
Well, I know, but there's got to be a
languages.
cause and a reason for your changes here, and I'm trying to find out what they are.
How many people do you think we should hire in the Armenian language service?
Well, what I think we should do is recognize the fact that Russia is attempting through misinformation to keep Armenia in their orbit. Do you believe that Russia is the aggressor in the war in Ukraine?
You know what? It's interesting that you really are concerned about Russia because VOA hired Russian spies. And I think that I didn't hear any complaints coming from you that I recall.
I asked you a question. Do you believe Russia is an adversary of the United States?
I think they are one of our adversaries, yes.
Okay, and
What I
why
love
would we
about this
undercut our
president is
strategy
he's trying to bring
and
the world
interest by
together.
dismissing staff who are countering Russian propaganda to potential partners of the United States? I mean, the reason is I mean, the focus today is on Iran. Okay, tomorrow it
thought
could
it
be
was on
Armenia.
Armenia.
Tomorrow it could be Armenia. And I think that when you put the Voice of America's Persian service on leave only to call them back after when Israel and we started trading missile strikes, I mean, isn't that a tacit admission that there were need for people to be on duty to provide that information, the voice of Iran?
I've worked in newsrooms. You surge on stories when you need to surge. We have always had the Farsi language as one of our statutory languages, and we've been covering it.
Well, my
and
my
when
time's
a story
expired,
breaks,
Ms.
you bring
Lake,
more
but
people on.
I think that you've got to look more carefully at how you reorganize this effort, and more to be determined, okay? Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, Ms. Lake, I will be recognizing myself. I recently held a subcommittee hearing on the State Department's censorship industrial complex, which was previously in the business of silencing American voices overseas and at home. Thanks to a thorough investigation and review by Congress and the Foreign Affairs Committee previously, and President Trump's leadership, that bureau is no more. Building off of that work here today, you've spoken extensively about the importance of telling America's story and standing up to censorship. In your view, what should be the mission of the U.S. Agency for Global Media going forward? Moreover, how can we ensure its position to effectively promote American values and counter propaganda from authoritarian regimes like the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, we definitely need to bring some huge changes to this agency. I believe that the agency should be eliminated, and then we should pull out the things that are of value. And VOA, Office of Cuba Broadcasting, we need to look at what works. And what works is telling America's story abroad. What doesn't work is being anti-American, telling the CCP propaganda abroad on our airwaves. And we need to modernize. I don't think doing 1990s television is effective anymore. People just aren't, that's not where they're getting their information.
What do you think some of the most important stories and tenets about America that need to be told that haven't been getting told?
I think that just the history of this country and what this country is about, our freedoms, our liberties, our Bill of Rights.
Maybe the founding of our country.
The founding
right?
of our country, yeah. And especially this year with 250 years.
That would seem to me a pretty big story to tell. I mean, that seems
You know,
like
one of the things that's
something that the rest of the world's going to pay attention to.
And one of the things that's statutorily required is to talk about all 50 states, including the beautiful parts of our country, all 50 states and tourism. Those are things that are actually in
By
the statute.
that, I'm sure you mean Michigan.
But
So I
Michigan's
appreciate
beautiful. One of my favorite states. I'm a Midwesterner. I was born there. I was born in the Midwest.
Right.
So we haven't been doing that, and we're trying to do what's statutorily required. Unfortunately, they've gotten into the habit of hiring foreigners to tell America's story.
Yeah.
And if you were born in another country, you don't know our history, you don't know our culture, in many cases you don't know our language, how do you effectively tell America's story?
That's the right question to be asking, and now we're looking for that solution of how to do that. I think there's growing consensus that America needs to do more to push back against authoritarian propaganda and censorship around the world, particularly from communist China, but other places as well. I have an example, a specific example from Southwest Michigan. I happen to represent a significant Burmese population in my district, many of whom with family and friends still subjected to the authoritarian military junta's role in Burma and their rule there. Many of these people have relied on Voice of America Burmese service to expose the malign activities of the CCP in its manipulation of the Burmese military junta, and oftentimes drive a more profound skepticism of Beijing's intentions. We were just having a dialogue with my colleague about the statutory languages and that kind of thing. Would it make sense to have flexibility to say, okay, let's surge in an area? You were talking about in a newsroom surges to where the information is. Wouldn't it make sense to have some flexibility to say, okay, you know what? Burma is a place that we need to be paying attention to, and so and move some of those assets around.
Absolutely.
But I'm curious, what role do you see organizations like USAGM, and you were just talking about possibly eliminating them, playing in the global information fight? What reforms do you prioritize to ensure that we're winning the battle? That's the most important thing.
Well, for starters, I'm going to prioritize making sure that we're getting out information that is not anti-American. That would be very disastrous, and we've done that in the past, and we don't want to do that anymore. And I'm going to work to make sure that's not happening. But you're right, we need to search. There's no expiration date on anything in the government. You know, if we are working to see to it that people of an oppressed nation are getting information, to know there are options out there, to know that there's a better way, And then when that nation is no longer being oppressed, we continue to operate there. It just doesn't make sense. But what they've done over the years, 84 years, is expand, 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 collecting more languages, covering more languages that we don't necessarily have to be covering. You know, one of our success stories is Office of Cuba Broadcasting directly into Cuba and getting into the ears and the hearts of the people of Cuba. But there will come a day where I believe there will be freedom for the people of Cuba. And then do we need to still continue to broadcast in? That's a question that needs to be asked. So we should have expiration dates when it's mission accomplished. It doesn't mean we continue to pour tens of millions of dollars more into it.
I appreciate that. My time has expired. With that, the chair recognizes Ms. Jayapal from Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Ms. Lake. The U.S. Agency for Global Media is tasked with providing unbiased news worldwide to over 427 million listeners, many of whom live in countries without freedom of press or freedom of the speech. And it is your job to promote the American ideals of freedom and democracy. So I wanted to start just by confirming, do you support democracy or authoritarianism?
I think that's pretty obvious. I support freedom and democracy.
Democracy. Great. Would you agree that accepting the results of a fair and free election are critical to a functioning democracy?
Would you agree that standing
That's
up
not
and
my
cheering
question is,
for a cancer survivor would have been the nice thing to do?
Ms. Lake, this is my time.
Okay.
Would you accept that accepting the results of a free and fair election are critical to a functioning democracy? It's a yes or no question. Do you think it's essential
I
for
think
democracy to have a free and fair election?
We need free and fair elections.
Free and fair
sadly,
elections,
we don't
great,
have
thank
them.
you so much. And yet, you have, to this day, refused to acknowledge that President Trump lost the 2020 election, something that even members of President Trump's own Justice Department have admitted and multiple lawsuits have shown. And we heard my colleague from Arizona talk about what happened in Arizona. So it concerns me that you are now tasked with this responsibility of ensuring democracy around the world when you won't even accept a free and fair election. I'm also concerned by your ability to promote the American ideals of freedom and democracy, given your record defending and praising dictators. Let's look at Hungary. You previously stated that Hungary is, quote, doing it right, and that Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban was, quote, the greatest in America, greatest in caps, and, quote, and equal to President Trump. Do you stand by those statements?
I think that Viktor Orban has done a very good job at protecting his people and protecting the Hungarian culture.
And so,
I think
Ms. Lake,
if you ask people in Europe, other parts of Europe,
the question here is very simple.
They would be wishing that their leaders stood up for their people.
Is Viktor Orban the greatest in Europe? Yes or no?
I think he's done the best job in Europe, yes.
Okay, and so even Secretary Rubio acknowledged in a 2019 letter that under Orban, Hungary took a downward democratic trajectory, and yet you insist that Hungary is doing it right. I want to cover some of the policies that Mr. Orban is responsible for. Would you consider banning LGBTQ pride parades like Viktor Orban has done in Hungary as doing it right, recognizing that pride parades are protected under the First Amendment?
What does this have to do with the U.S. Agency
I'm
for Global
asking you
Media?
whether you support the policies of dictators and authoritarians or whether you support democracy. You have said that Viktor Orban is the greatest in Europe. So do you think that Viktor Orban is doing it right when he bans pride parades?
I think Viktor Orban has put the people of his country first.
So the
and
answer
I'm
is
not
yes,
here
you
to
think it's
discuss Viktor
appropriate that he's
Orban.
banning pride parades and using facial recognition technology to actually profile people that go to those parades. How about the fact that Orban and his party control 80% of Hungary's media market?
Are we here
Is
talking
that
about
level,
Hungary?
Yes, we are, because guess what? Your agency actually is responsible for other countries
Hungary
and
is an
unbiased
ally. Can I
news.
remind you that Hungary is an ally of America?
Oh, and so you think that it's okay that Viktor Orban, the greatest in Europe, according to you, controls 80% of Hungary's media market? Is that level free and fair reporting?
I don't. You obviously don't like our ally Hungary. I think that
I'm
the
asking
people have
you
voted
if
for him,
you
and the
think
people of
that it's
Hungary will decide.
appropriate. Ms. Lake, it is my time. I'm asking you if it is appropriate that a country, Viktor Orban's government, controls 80% of Hungary's media market. It's just a yes or a no. Do you think that's okay? Think he's the greatest of all
I don't have
time?
an opinion on what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary.
It's not up for
Other
debate.
than I
It's
know
a
he puts his
fact
people
that has been
first.
documented by numerous organizations.
who?
Now,
Can you
not
tell me
only
where that
have you
fact come from?
supported, not only
Where
have
did
you
that
supported.
fact come
Excuse
from,
me, Ms. Lake.
Representative?
I'm sorry to remind you, you are not a governor. You're not even a candidate for governor. You're here, and this is my time. Not only have you supported dictators that have supported policies that erode democracy, you also spread claims promoted by Russian state media that the Pentagon was funding bioweapon labs in Ukraine. These claims have been proven resoundingly false, even by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Do you still stand by that prior
Look,
statement, Ms. Lake?
I know that many members of Congress care more about
Do
funding
you
Ukraine
stand
than
by that statement,
order.
which is clearly a lie?
I know that you
are
voted.
responsible for an agency that is supposed to promote truth, and yet, over and over again, you are promoting dictators and authoritarians and lies. So I am asking you if you stand by the statement that you made that was promoted by Russian state media that the Pentagon was funding bioweapon labs in Ukraine. Proven false by Marco Rubio. Do you stand by that
I
statement?
understand you're trying to get a fundraising video here.
Okay,
So
well,
let me
you
help
clearly
make-
don't
let me
understand that
reminding
you
the
are
people-
Ladies,
actually
time
here
has
bef-
expired.
District.
before
Your time
Congress.
expired,
Mr.
Ms.
Chairman, I
Jayapal.
just want to say
you had
that
more than enough time. I gave you a few extra
I
seconds, and your
understand,
time
and
has expired.
unfortunately,
and I now recognize Representative
Ms. Lake
Davidson.
is not responding
Can
to
I
the
have
questions.
just 1 second to respond? Because who is going to be speaking
Representative
next?
Davidson is next.
Oh, may I have just 1 second to respond to that? Obviously, from some of the questions we're hearing from the Democrats, they care more about a lot of other countries than America. And we've seen that in their votes, with the money they voted just to spend in Ukraine killing people. Thankfully, we have a president in Donald J. Trump who's going to help bring peace.
Maybe we could have regular order, Mr. Chairman?
Seems pretty regular to me. Representative Davidson is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. Ms. Lake, I want to let you know that Voice of America is just such an important part of Ohio's history. In Westchester, Ohio, we have Voice of America Park, and it recognizes the Voice of America Bethany Relay Station, which served as a key anchor to get the message that Voice of America was broadcasting, whether to Europe or South America, and Crosley Broadcasting's there. So I'd invite you and your team to come to Westchester, Ohio at some point and tour the museum, highlight the history of the Voice of America.
Of
and,
Ohio.
I think the values that Voice of America, put into action, really, and made known, America's values, are part of the story of victory in the Cold War. And in Munich earlier this year, Vice President Vance gave a speech expressing his fear that in Europe, these freedoms are under attack. The things that we fought to protect Europe from, we now see, speaking of sanctuary, we have people claiming asylum from the UK, from Germany, and from Poland in Hungary today. So they are protecting civil liberties for people that are being put in jail for memes in places like Germany and England. So, looking at widespread censorship online, you look at the values that seem under attack by the digital regulation in the European Union, Voice of America can still play an important role in the world. So unfortunately, we've seen our institutions that help defend democracy being wielded in some ways to undermine it, even within various administrations. So I think your reshaping of this institution is incredibly important. Unfortunately, revelations from Voice of America show the U.S. is not immune from actions to shape speech. A new Iron Curtain is falling over the West under the guise of censorship. If you have unapproved views on migration, vaccines, or election results, or any number of things, your freedoms can be taken away because the woke religion has its own heresy code. People are seeking to use components of our own government to enforce their political ideology. So, Ms. Lake, can you expand further on the bias which as USA GM has operated over the years?
I would love to. Actually, I wish I didn't have to. I wish that I could report to you that there was no bias, but there's been a lot of bias, and I've got just a few headlines here. This one says, Voice of America slants news, delays Biden's debate stumble story. Voice of America election news went from 1996 to 2020, went from balance to bias. Will Voice of America campaign video that they ran for Biden help him win Michigan? Why is Voice of America getting involved in politics? How about this one? Voice of America director Amanda Bennett resigned amid accusations of failing to stop China and Iran propaganda in VOA programs. And guess what? She was then hired back by Joe Biden to run the agency and nearly ran it into the ground. She's the one responsible for a $250 million 15-year lease in a swanky high-rise that they were going to put VOA in had I not stopped it. And this high-rise isn't even equipped to do broadcasting. That was going to cost the American taxpayer another $100 million at least. When are we going to start putting the American people first?
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that. You know, America's resources should advance America's interest, and thanks for being a good custodian of that. You know, reading in background for this, I was stunned to find that Voice of America's former associate editor for News Standards, Carol Grunsberg, directed staff to, quote, avoid calling Hamas and its members terrorists, in quotes. Why do you think Voice of America was hesitant to call Hamas and its members terrorists?
Because, you know, as I've mentioned, there's a true bias going on. They're pushing an agenda, and they, in many cases, are opposed to whatever the policy of America is. And they have completely gone off the rails, and we need to get them back on the rails. And that's what we're doing. We're reducing the size of this. And in many ways, maybe the people reporting were actually okay with a terrorist attack like that.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting the concern on security risks. I mean, in your testimony, you discuss how many individuals have granted access to secure government facilities or IT systems via false social security numbers or other false credentials. It's especially disorienting to hear about large numbers of staff receiving clearances and access to sensitive material when House Representatives can't even get clearances for some of our staff members. What steps are you taking to clean up the clearance rosters?
Well, right now we have a director of security who's doing an incredible job trying to clean up the mess. And one of the things we're doing is reducing the number of people who have security clearances. I think one of the members said, why does a reporter need a security clearance? I think it was the chairman who said that. And we went through and we are starting to weed out and pare down that list. We took all of the presidents of the various grantees. Those are not government employees. They all had top secret clearances, and we revoked that, and they cried like crazy when we did it, but there's no reason to have that. RFA, Radio Free Asia, asked our security director if we would build a SCIF in their facility. Why on earth would they need a SCIF? So
Yeah.
we're doing everything we can to try to get things back under control, but I think President Trump has the right idea. We need to eliminate this agency, find what's salvageable, and move it over to the Department of State.
Thank you so much for that clarity. And, you know, certainly we're not going to broadcast
Gentleman's
classified
time has
information.
expired.
So thank you for safeguarding it.
Chair now recognizes Representative Olszewski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Chairman Ranking Member Meeks for convening this hearing. Thank you, Ms. Lake, for joining us today. I am a new member on this committee, but in just the past few months, I've seen how important in person the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other USAGM outlets are to Americans and to our allies. It's vital to diplomacy. It connects and informs people as we seek to promote our democracy and our freedom around the world. Indeed, VOA and USAGM outlets are American soft power weapons. And central to the mission of an international broadcasting agency is truth and is balance. What we share with the world should be rooted in fact so that America maintains its credibility on the world stage. I'm sharing these concerns because I recently know through my travel and in some countries that USAGM is the sole source of credible information. I was just in Taiwan where government officials and NGOs made it clear Radio Free Asia is an indispensable tool against PRC misinformation and aggression. And to that end, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter two articles into the record, one from Politico, Moscow and Beijing rejoicing at looming death of Radio Free Europe, VOA, and another one from the Washington Post, Chinese propaganda surges as the U.S. defunds Radio Free Asia.
Without objection.
Thank you. Ms. Lake, I have just a few questions today. I hope the first one is pretty simple. Yes or no, do you believe in the mission of USAGM and its grantees are important?
It's really like the yes or no answers,
I think
don't
that's
you?
a pretty easy one, but.
I believe in the mission. I wish that it were followed.
Okay, and I appreciate that. but worry that, as my colleagues have shared, executing on that mission is very difficult with an administration that is gutting our only way in some parts of the world of sharing the most, in the most oppressive of media markets, information that needs to be shared. Media reports, for example, indicated that VOA broadcast just 75 minutes of content to its audience in Iran over the past few days, knowing that we used to broadcast 24/7. And I know that you mentioned that there's not a huge audience, but it's come to my attention that VOA's Persian audience has actually doubled in the past 4 years. As of June 2023, in the middle of that growth, it was measured that the outlet was covering almost 16% of all adult Iranians. So I just would say, as we're facing a very unsettled world, I think having information is really important. And so I think that is perhaps why we're seeing, as in the articles I shared, that our adversaries are in fact celebrating this retrenchment from our involvement. I'd like to read an article.
Can I say something about that? I think
I'll give you an
CCP
opportunity, ma'am.
might be
I'm happy to give you an opportunity. Quote, the so-called beacon of freedom, VOA, has now been discarded by its own government like a dirty rag. This is from the Chinese Communist Party's owned Global Times paper. Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman Mao Ning seems to agree with your characterization of VOA as, quote, a lie factory that stirs up conflict, with a notorious track record in their China coverage. I guess my question to you, is it concerning, or should it be concerning to us as members of this committee, that you share the same opinion as a Chinese Communist government spokesperson?
The Chinese government, if they are upset about having less coverage, it's because they were in control of a lot of our coverage. The CCP, and I think you came in late, actually
No, ma'am, I've been here the entire time.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't notice. The CCP has more control over what we put out editorially than people who are management at the agency. Do you think that's okay?
No, I think we should be putting out truthful information, and sometimes,
and as you see here, the former
and
leader,
we should go after that. And sometimes, but what I do, what is concerning to me is if you, and you've already said that your goal ultimately is to move this agency and its independence, which is truly a core pillar of journalism. As someone who is in journalism, having that independence is absolutely important. There's no other way that we're going to be a credible source to the world if other governments and other members of countries see what we're doing. I mean, first of all, we're not communicating, but when we do, they have to know that the information is real, it's authentic, and it's actually advancing American interests. I very much look forward to working with my colleagues on the committee here so that we can make sure the information is truthful, it is factual, and that it advances American interests. You have my commitment to work with you on that, but we have to make sure that we're actually promoting those interests through supporting this work.
Hopefully we can root out the Russian, Chinese, Iranian propaganda that has been prevalent on our airwaves at VOA, and we're going to work to do that.
Chair now recognizes Representative Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lake, I'm sorry you've had to endure these ad hominem attacks, which are clearly designed to shift focus away from the patriotic work that you're doing to honor hardworking American taxpayers, and make sure not only that you're cleaning out the corruption and, frankly, the rot within this agency, but actually advancing American national security as opposed to actively undermining it.
That's right.
And to my colleague who just asked you about Beijing and Beijing rejoicing, the reason why Beijing needs to be a focus of this conversation is we need to be asking the question, and I think you just did, why is the Chinese Communist Party in charge of VOA? Why are they running VOA? Past leadership of the VOA Mandarin language service conducted annual meetings with the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., allowing Chinese embassy officials to opine and make suggestions on VOA Mandarin language service content. Chinese Communist Party officials have also reached out to VOA hosts to convince them to be more supportive of the communist regime, and the outcomes have actually rewarded the CCP's efforts. VOA's Mandarin language service personalities have hosted events at the Chinese embassy, and one of VOA's television editors even publicly pledged his allegiance to the People's Republic of China at a Chinese embassy event. Is this correct,
This
Ms.
is
Lake?
correct. This is correct, and whistleblowers in the agency and in the Mandarin service who tried to stop that were fired or got so burned out trying to stop it, they left the job.
So VOA also allowed communist Vietnamese and communist Chinese embassies in Washington, D.C. to pressure them into removing videos, cutting short live interviews, or changing story angles so that the coverage was more supportive of the communist governments of Hanoi and Beijing. Is this the voice of America, or is this the voice of Beijing?
Some have said it's the voice of anti-America.
Yeah, so I think that your efforts to reform the agency are vital to American national security. Why are we allowing the CCP to run the VOA newsroom while the U.S. taxpayer is on the hook for this? Are any of these VOA employees who acted on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, are they still employed?
It's possible. We're working to try to figure that out, but unfortunately, when you do a reduction in force, it's called a RIF, and we are reducing the number of people who work at Voice of America, you can't, typical government fashion, you can't say, hey, we'd like to keep certain people because they are people who are performing well and doing a good job. You can't do that in the government. You just remove positions.